Great. Thank you so much. So as folks are coming in, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Charles Caminiti, the Executive Director for the National Recycling Coalition, and really excited to present the wonderful information that we have today. And I see that still a number of people are coming into the webinar, so we'll get started here shortly. I'd like to get started as soon as we can because there's a lot of great information to present. But let's give folks a couple of minutes, and then I'll go through a little bit of housekeeping, and then we'll get started. So a little bit of patience there. We have people coming in the waiting room. So.
Charlie, let's get going. I can let people in the waiting
Okay,
room as they arrive.
very good, very good. So I'm going
Thank
to
you.
stop sharing so people can see who I am. I do want to just say hello to everybody and thank you. We have a lot of information to bring forward. We're going to go ahead and get started. This meeting is being recorded. I want to double check that it is being recorded, and we'll provide the recording to all of our attendees once we're completed here. What I would like to do is introduce briefly. Oh, well, let me do the housekeeping first. So we have about an hour and a half, and we'll get started on this program. And we will be doing Q&A. So go ahead, the Q&A, I've already activated it. So if you have questions, go ahead and put those in there. We will answer the questions after our final speaker. And any questions, like if there's so many, because there's so many attendees today, if there's some that don't get answered, we'll get them answered to make sure that that information gets out to everybody. I thought I had the chat disabled, but I guess Zoom is smarter than I am, so the chat's running in there. So the same with the chat, don't be rude, but if you have questions in the chat, we'll make sure that we get those as well. I do want to welcome everybody. We have people from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. We have people from Canada as well in the room, so I want to thank you. Let's get started. I will like to introduce that our key speakers today are Heidi Sanborn. Everybody knows Heidi Sanborn, Executive Director for the National Stewardship Action Council, as well as Tristan Steichen, who's the management consultant and the Executive Director of the National Lubricant Container Recycling Coalition. And as well, we're going to have Jay Bassett. Jay Bassett is the NRC's a board of director. He's a chair, but as well, he's a former EPA official. And what Jay's going to do is he's going to be acting as our key listener today. So towards the end, after Tristan, we'll have Jay talk a little bit about what we heard, put some context to it, help get us in the mindset of putting all these pieces together, and then some takeaways from that. And then I'm happy to say that we'll have some final comments from our Vice President of the NRC, Jeremy Drake, because we've been doing a lot of work. So with that, I am going to introduce Heidi to the stage here. I'm going to stop sharing, and she has a presentation that she'll have. And Heidi, it's all you.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm so happy to be here. It's great to be here with all of you, and thanks for making the time. So I'll start, let's see, get this started from the beginning. Again, I'm Heidi. I've been working in this field now, believe it or not, 35 years, all based in Sacramento, and I've been a regulator, a consultant, and a advocate. Been an advocate now for 20 years, since 2006. And it's my passion is to advocate for a responsible circular economy. And that is the vision. The vision is that we attain a circular economy in the United States. For the National Stewardship Action Council, which is our lobbying arm, and our C3 arm, which is the Stewardship Action Foundation. Today, we're going to talk about the current state of packaging and responsible end markets, but there's lots of other things that we've sprinkled in, including labeling and how that affects recycling and purchasing, and also how packaging is related to hazardous waste and hazardous waste packaging. So we're going to get into this, and then we're happy to take questions at the end. Again, I represent two organizations at the C3, which does education and support of the advocacy lobbying that the C4 does at the National Stewardship Action Council. And I'm getting some feedback. I don't know if somebody's got their mic on. Thank you. So our unique role is that we bridge policy, industry, and environmental advocates at the state and national levels. I speak all over the country and all over the world. And we're in the room when the rules are made. And in SB 54 in California, I was one of the 25 negotiators of that bill. We had 100 meetings in 8 months to get that bill hammered out. And we won't have time to go into all the things that have happened since then, but just some of them. We're going to talk about responsible end markets, for example. But we're not a watchdog group, although we do stay on top of our bills. And once you pass a bill, that's just the beginning. You got to make sure it works on the ground. But I always want to start with this because I think people understand it. If the bathtub is overflowing, what is the first place you go to address the problem? It's not the mop. It's the spigot. You turn the spigot off first, then you start mopping. But what we've been doing with waste management is mop, 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 mop. We will never get it all. It's super energy intensive and it's ineffective. So it's costly, and that's silly because when you have this example, it makes it pretty clear, right? You always go for the spigot first. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. And that's why we do what we do, because I want to turn off the spigot, get packages and materials right-sized. If they can be source reduced or anything, we need to do that first, and then we go after the mop. And the circular economy, as defined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, says this. It's based on 3 principles. The first is designing waste and pollution out of the system, right-sizing. Then you keep products and materials in use, organics in the organic stream, industrial products and chemicals in the industrial recycling stream. If they cross, that's pollution. And then you go back and regenerate the natural systems that we've harmed. And we've harmed everything, including our own bodies. Even with packaging, I used to think it could be considered non-toxic, but finding out all the toxic chemicals in packaging, I don't believe that anymore. I think some of them are actually dangerous. But we need to decouple our economic activity from the consumption of finite resources. And that's my passion and what I've spent my life, my career doing. We've had thanks to all of you who support us and our members. We have had great success in sponsoring bills in California. And the reason we do it in California and why I moved here from Michigan is because we're 12% of the market. If we move, the rest will follow. So, and it matters. So we get all the lobbyists here and everybody can have good negotiations and hopefully come up with good bills. So we've done things like SB 54. We've done a lot of truth in labeling, a lot of things in hazardous waste. These are all the bills that we've passed, except for the one that got vetoed by the governor on distress flares for boats. That's a long story, but it shouldn't have been vetoed. But we've done hazardous waste reuse and exchange bills. We've done bills to reduce this burden of aqua toxicity testing of hazardous waste. We've done prevention of, there's no need for mercury lighting anymore. Why do we put mercury in glass and sell it to everybody? That's crazy, especially when we have LEDs. So that are more efficient and actually last longer. So we've worked in all of these things. Paint care, that was my first bill way back in 2010 after, I should say, the first bill was mercury thermostats. But this has been a passion of mine a long time because hazardous products contaminate the non-hazardous. And I will talk about that as it relates to packaging. We've got 2 bills in the legislature now. One, they're both being heard on Tuesday. One to ban the sale of nitrous oxide laughing gas cylinders, no laughing matter. And then medium format batteries like e-bike batteries. So again, this is the final day we lobbied to get the packaging bill in California to the governor. You may not know all these people, but I can tell you it's lobbyists for Republic Services, Consumer Health Products Association, the biodegradable packaging industry, the Chamber of California, Oceana, etc. We had everybody working together because we spent so much time together hammering out every word of the bill. So you can make big things happen. You can do it the right way with discussion and not just jamming a bill down someone's throat. And I want to remind everybody that this is what democracy looks like when it's done right. And we need a lot more of this in the future. So EPR for packaging. We now, in 3 years, passed 7 EPR for packaging bills in this country. The reason I'm underscoring that is we've had 50 years of bottle bills and we only have 10. And they're 4% of the waste stream, bottles and cans, versus packaging, which is closer to 25. So what does that do? We've now got the biggest group of manufacturers pushed into 7 bills, which are not harmonized. We're not harmonized on definitions. We're not harmonized on responsible end markets. We're not harmonized on a lot of things that make it extremely difficult for them to oversee. So what does that make them want to do? Find harmony. And if they can't find harmony, then it's going to be a real problem for affordability. And everybody wants to put affordability at the top. We all are having trouble making ends meet. So one of the things that we need harmony on is what are responsible end markets. We're very excited that Circular Action Alliance is really leaning into this. And they have launched a public comment period from May 5th until July 7th for you to comment on their responsible end market standard. I, for one, have been frustrated that our history was about collection, but it's not recycling or circular until you make it into something else and do no harm. But we were doing a lot of offshore shipping. We were not putting eyes on those facilities, and we all know what that led to. E-waste on the sides of rivers in China, kids picking through things in Africa, no good. So I'm very excited we've gone on to responsible end markets and put them in the bills, but now we have to really work out the details. And this is really important. I encourage you all to review the draft. I have it right here, the public comment. It is only 27 pages long. So please go ahead and look at that and submit comments if you hadn't planned to. I urge you to do that. Circular Action Alliance also received approval from Oregon Department of Environmental Quality on their program plan amendment for responsible end markets. I put the link to the actual program plan there because it includes the responsible end markets section that they approved. Oregon has been a leader in recycling and responsible end markets, and they really pay attention to this. So I feel like it's probably the gold standard that we should all be following. So please look at that, see if you support it, and then make your comments to Circular Action Alliance on their proposal. Now, one of the problems we have with packaging, hazardous waste, and pretty much everything is we've got the Wild West in the United States when it comes to labeling. There is no federal requirement for some of the claims that are made, whether it's recyclable, flushable, reusable, what have you. And I have been quoted in the New York Times saying nobody should be able to lie to the public. And we've done more bills than anybody else in the country on this issue. Why is it important? Because if you put something on the shelf that says it's recyclable or compostable or biodegradable, people believe it because they think the government has checked that. And then they buy it thinking they're doing a good thing. They'll put it in the recycling bin or the composting bin because it says it's recyclable or compostable, and you end up with a mess. And then you have to spend all this money to sort it. You've got contamination because you can't unscramble the egg. And it's a problem, a very big problem. And you're driving the wrong markets because people are buying things that they thought were good and they're not. So we've been a real leader in this whole thing about truth in labeling. In fact, we passed I think second or third bill on flushable wipes, saying they're not flushable, they're plastic, we don't want them in the water. That is now in Congress is a bipartisan bill. And we're hoping that it's going to get to the Senate floor. And the reason I bring this up is all of you can help with this, but this also gets to packaging. Because if we label things, people, again, they will do what you say. If it says wipes are flushable, they flush them and then they flood their house and have plumbing costs. And quite frankly, I told Kimberly Clark, I think it's mean. So this is what it looks like, these fatbergs that end up in the
So
fat.
Heidi, you're not sharing your slide deck at this time?
I am.
Yeah, I
Oh,
see
hold
it.
on.
I see
Oh,
it,
okay.
Shirley.
I'm on the wrong screen. My apologies, folks.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad everybody could see it. So we're excited that we have this bipartisan group saying that nobody should lie on the label on wipes. But I have to tell you, do we really have to spend 6 years of legislation to get companies to stop literally lying on the label? I mean, this is ridiculous. So I think we need a whole new system, but we don't have that right now. We have green guides, not enforcement. So it's just something I wanted to bring to your attention because this is what happens. This is what affects packaging, EPR costs, and this is a huge problem. So you've got a red cup that's not recyclable with a chasing arrow on the bottom, which, by the way, we passed the bill that's being challenged in court that will take that chasing arrow off that red cup by next year because they are not recyclable. And then the Enviro cooler that says biodegradable foam, lie. No microplastics, lie. Um, and it's recyclable, yes, maybe technically, but it's not going to be recycled at any high level. So these are the kinds of problems that we have out there. Now, when it comes to hazardous packaging, here's a vape, a cannabis vape, that was literally labeled truly disposable. Does anybody know what that means? I don't. But to the average person, that means you just throw it in the trash. And what do we have in there? A battery. So, and we've seen our fires just screaming through the roof, which increase costs, increase danger, makes our insurance want to leave the industry. So we got that changed in California. Oh, if you could mute whoever, we don't have the feedback. Thanks. Um, that would be, that was wonderful. We worked with the cannabis industry, but again, we're having to pass laws against this. So we need a better standard. And I'm going to bring up why this relates to packaging. So we passed all these bills in California on hazardous wastes, different things, ag pesticide containers, recalled products, the lead-based painted lunch boxes, fluorescent or electronics, batteries, paint. But when we passed the paint care bill, and I worked on that in 2010, we didn't contemplate the package. We didn't include it in the bill. So what does that mean? They don't have funding or the responsibility to recycle the package in the paint care program. And that's a miss. So what happens? Then it gets pulled into the packaging program. Paint is not, that horrible of a thing, but we have products that are very dangerous, especially things that are in plastic, like pesticides, diazinon. I've seen them in white plastic containers, LDPE, that say, triple rinse and throw in your recycling bin. We all know plastic absorbs chemicals. This is a serious problem. We do not want that kind of labeling, but there's nobody stopping them. We also don't have clarity around color. I would love to see the day when every plastic packet or every hazardous waste container that's plastic is black, so we can clearly identify it in a bale and get it out, whether it's got a label or not. But we don't have that now, so they're ending up commingled, and that will affect the food grade packaging. But nobody's testing. You don't test for thousands of chemicals on every bale. So it's just something I wanted you all to be aware of and think about. And then I'm going to turn it over to Tristan in a few minutes. But packaging, we have to be careful going forward with new bills. When we do packaging, do we want to exclude all hazardous waste packages? And we all know that when at hazardous waste facilities, we want them to come back in the original package, because that way, if it has a label, we can really clearly identify what it is and manage it appropriately for safety reasons as well as cost reasons. So where we are with oil is when I was in the SB 54 negotiations, I was very clear that I wanted hazardous waste packaging out. I did not want them commingled with food grade. I want to get EPR for hazardous waste, and I want all those packages to go back to those producers to deal with the issues they're going to have with packages that have been contaminated with the product that might be hazardous. The problem is the way it was written, we excluded all the federally hazardous stuff, but the stuff that's sold as non-hazardous, like oil, that when it's returned open is considered hazardous, they were not contemplated, and so they're in the packaging bill. So what does that mean for lubricants and other products that were in this category? They will have to pay into two pros if this is not changed, and one for packaging and one for the product. But we want the product back in the package. If you don't, you're contaminating another container. So we have to think this through, and this is something I'm excited to bring to your attention as we get into these details of these bills. So I'm excited also that the lubricants industry has formed a packaging management association, a PRO. They just got approved by the Colorado Department of Public Health under the state's EPR law to comply to take their own packages and recycle them like they do in Canada. I know they're talking in California. We had a bill. I supported it because of this wanting to keep things separate and make it easier for them to just control their package and their product. So anyway, I just want to make sure we brought this up, and Tristan will speak to this as well. So future challenges. There are many that never stopped us, right? If it was easy, somebody else would be doing it. But these are important. We're making a lot of progress, and I do not want that lost in this conversation. Litigation is what Americans do, and they are challenging in court EPR, sales bans, how we collaborate. We have 9 AGs that are going after groups like the U.S. Plastics Pact and others on that. They're even now suing California about which pro was selected for the textile program. It's not going to stop. We just keep going. It'll all work itself out. That's what it does. And then harmonizing things that matter. We need to look together at what lessons are we learning from these first 7 states? How do we harmonize the definitions so it's easier on the industry and it's easier on all of us on reporting, on metrics, and so forth. And responsible end markets are a big part of that. And that's important for affordability. If these programs are not more affordable than what we had, we will not get more of these bills. We have got to make sure that we can document it's more affordable overall, system-wide, long-term. EPR for hazardous waste and packaging need to be worked out, this whole thing. We got to think about that. Tariffs are not being used to support remade in America. That's a problem. We've still got a lot of imported plastics coming that are undermining our markets in the United States, and that's affecting packaging, EPR costs, and markets. Subsidies to big companies continue to undermine the small recyclers. Some pros are testing the limits of enforcement, as I said, whether it's carpet and meds and sharps. That's been a thing. The pros are suing CalRecycle over that. At least the pharmaceutical folks. Most industries do not come to the table, unfortunately, in a leadership position. They come because there's a threat of a bill. And I've told industries over and over, be at the table, not on the menu. None of us know their business like they do. We welcome them, but if they wait too long, you will have disharmony. And then we are not okay with preemption generally, ever. So covered product crossover and confusion. Again, the hazardous waste and the primary packaging and commingling food grade with hazardous. How does that work? And then the older programs like paint. We didn't include the paint pails, but those are highly recyclable, and the recyclers can't get money from CAA to cover them because, the paint care program, because they're not covered in that program. Should we go back and fix that? So I just want to say the opportunities and hope are that even the European Union is coming to the United States to help us. They are literally 25 years ahead of us in these programs. I just spoke in Arizona and Phoenix at the EU Circular Economy Conference sponsored by the EU. Very high level people. We even had the governor of Arizona there. And we're really talking about how to work across the pond, about harmonizing across like Europe and the United States and North America, because it does make sense that most of these companies sell internationally. And there's a lot of hope there. So I have a lot of collaboration amongst NGOs and other stakeholders. And I want to thank again Charles and NRC for even hosting this. It was based, I guess, on my recommendation at their conference that we radically collaborate because we need to in order to be successful.
Yeah.
So we've got five working groups. One is hazardous waste, one is packaging. If you're not a member, please look into that. You're welcome to email or call me, and you can use the QR code. But we talk about these things in details every month on our working groups, which are national, and they're very insightful. And we've got a Remade in America pledge. We'd love for you to sign that too. So you can, and Charles will send out this slide deck after the conference or the workshop.
Absolutely. We're running at time here. So
Yep,
are you about there?
I'm there. So I'm done, and thank you. And I hope that was helpful.
It was totally helpful, Heidi. There's so much information that you provide, and we'll send the information out, like you said, and do other events with you as well. So thank you so much. I see that there's a couple of questions in the Q&A. We'll get to those again after the speakers. Thank you again, Heidi. Let's bring forward Tristan. Tristan Steichen, the floor is yours. Great job, Heidi.
There we go. You guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Been having difficulties with the mute button today. So, thanks, Charles, for the intro and the opportunity to speak to everybody today. As mentioned, my name is Tristan Steichen. I'm with the National Lubricant Container Recycling Coalition. We are in the process of at some point rebranding and changing the name. It's a mouthful, and I'm getting tired of saying it, so we just say the NLCRC. I've been in the consulting industry 31 years now, in different aspects of waste management, compliance, as a management consultant supporting industry. But sort of over the last third of my career, I've focused on sort of this idea of collective actions or collaborations with various industries. At one point, there was beverage. At other points, I've been working with healthcare, plastics, and now with the lubricants industry, and looking at sort of market level sustainability investments and changes at sort of a larger scale. So that's sort of my background, but it's always been sort of around the waste area. And I would say over the past third of my career has been directly focused on circular economy and sort of end-to-end type solutions. The NLCRC has actually been around since 2020. Our goal initially was lubricant industry members. So it involves participants from across the value chain. So not just producers, but plastic manufacturers or packaging manufacturers, recyclers, haulers, collectors. So the representation from around the value chain, and we're continuing to engage others in this process. But our goal was really an acknowledgement that, and Heidi mentioned the challenges with lubricants because of their classification, but also it was dirty, right? So you've got some sort of messy plastics or messy packaging materials that, when commingled with other packaging, can contaminate larger loads. So there's arguments for separation, but our goal was really initially, let's keep this stuff out of landfill. And so let's build a national program that does that with circularity in mind. So package to package would be great, but at a minimum, let's get this stuff recycled and then see where we go from there. I think what happened very shortly after our formation in 2020 was the reality of EPR. So EPR has sort of, I guess, catalyzed our priorities because now we're focused specifically on those states that have passed legislation. Heidi mentioned that there's 7 of those. So I kind of wanted to make sure that everyone understood that's sort of what our focus is. Also mentioned earlier was LPMA or Interchange 360. Those are interchangeable terms. LPMA is the 501c3 that is executing as a stewardship organization or a producer responsibility organization for lubricant packaging and HHW products in approved states. So Interchange 360 is sort of the branded approach. That LPMA is the name. And so, as Heidi mentioned, they are operating in Colorado, and we are seeking, or they are seeking approval. I obviously work very closely with them. They are seeking approvals in other packaging states that allow that pathway. California was a bit different in that we were looking at a separate piece of legislation because, as we'll get into, there are a lot of um, there are a lot of things that make our materials and packaging unique that doesn't necessarily align with a large overarching packaging collection system. And so that's what we're trying to address. So I'm going to get into some of the experiences and challenges that any industry faces with EPR, but I'm also going to lean a little bit into the uniqueness of lubricants. And I think that it's been said and implied a few times, but to be clear, um, because of the nature of the
You
Muted.
muted.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody muted me. All right, I'm not muted anymore. Okay. This packaging fits into the hard to recycle category due to the residual product that remains in the packaging. So that's sort of challenge number one. Challenge number two is that because of its separation, the capacity, both at a state level and across the US, is extremely limited to process this packaging. Now, you can go to other mechanical recyclers or what have you, but because of its contaminated nature, you have to make additional investments in processing equipment and so forth. So you have to be prepared for those kinds of things. So the capacity is a challenge. Um, the existing models of single pros, and Heidi mentioned CAA, um, that's all fine for certain categories of packaging products, but in our case, a lot of the requirements that are built into there just don't make a whole lot of sense when it comes to lubricant packaging. One of the big ones that comes up is the nature and extent of the package itself, and there are a lot of requirements around reducing or lightweighting it or coming up with solutions to change the format. Lubricant bottles are different. They need to maintain certain levels of integrity. You can't drop a bottle of lubricant and have the same outcomes that if you dropped a bottle of water. So that matters. And so those kinds of things need to be considered in the policies. And then I think like any other industry, there are financial risks associated with compliance around things that don't necessarily affect the industry. So, and I can get into a little bit more detail on what those challenges are, but what I think, whether you're a small entity or a large entity, from a producer standpoint, these are very, especially when you're dealing with chemicals, but any product, these are very complex supply chains. And there's a lot of macroeconomic issues that can have an impact on these supply chains. Using current political challenges, what they are with this situation with the Strait of Hormuz, that has a very significant impact on the lubricant industry because base oils are sourced to some producers from that area. So you have a lot of these geopolitical challenges that create additional strain on industries. And so you're trying to balance all of these issues, managing supply chains and then managing compliance type issues like EPR and what you're trying to do from an NLCRC perspective and develop recycling or circular solutions. So there's a lot of complexity that's mixed into all of this. So Heidi mentioned the seven states, and I think I've often looked at the European Union, the EC policies, and oftentimes there's a lot of comparisons between what the United States has experienced, what Canada has experienced, and they've been running a lubricant and packaging collection program for over 20 years, and certain provinces even longer than that. It's been very successful, but it's also a very different set of dynamics there. And Europe is different still in how that's implemented. But challenges with the patchwork is it creates differences in definitions and requirements. So from a distribution and sales perspective of products and waste management, it becomes very difficult to standardize and become efficient when there's different interpretations of definitions, which I think that the concept of responsible end markets is important and that it be consistent. So if you're going to model a state like Oregon that Heidi suggested, or they're looking at comments in California, the key here is to be standardized. The other challenges is just in the distribution network and sales network itself. When you have islands of programs like Colorado in a sea of other states that don't, when you don't have states adjacent to each other, it reduces efficiency. Or Minnesota or Maryland or Maine, when you have these different EPR states that are kind of in pockets out there, it makes it harder to implement distribution and solutions when, there can be a producer that sells product to a distributor, and that distributor could send that product to multiple states. And so it's figuring out how to deal with states that do have EPR laws and those that don't. It can become very confusing. I 100% agree with the concept of harmonization. But perhaps I've been doing this a little bit too long. I'm growing increasingly frustrated with more and more conversations. I'm interested in action. So I do see discussions happening. I do see some solutions being worked from a harmonization perspective, but I'm outcome focused, and I'd like to see some actions around, well, how is that actually going to work, and who's going to step up and sort of lead that? I've mentioned the administrative challenges with this. Most of my time is spent in the lubricant space, but I also support companies outside of lubricants, and I can tell you that even figuring out what materials are in your packaging products, what the weights are, what the formats are, you are trying to collect this information from, in many cases, a global supply chain. So a company could have hundreds of OEMs that are manufacturing products for a brand that you need to understand. And then it's taking that information, calibrating that with distribution and sales, and then managing the different reporting requirements in each of the states because of those different statutory and regulatory definitions. It makes this thing very challenging. And like any system level sort of compliance obligation, and industry has seen this a lot on climate reporting and things like that. Data is everything. And being able to track and manage data while still protecting what's proprietary and confidential from either a producer standpoint, a retailer standpoint, a distributor standpoint becomes very, very complex. So it's sort of managing through all of that. These are things that every industry and every producer is sort of trying to figure out. So now let's sort of dial that into so the lubricants are dealing with that. So that's number one. I think the challenges that we face are when we look at the overall impact of lubricant packaging versus all other packaging that would be covered by EPR, we're less than 1%. It seems like a lot in the HHW space, but when you look at it overall, our biggest material is rigid HDPE. Think of the oil bottle. There are other packaging types and so forth, but HDPE, blow molded HDPE is really the dominant material. I've mentioned the challenges that when you have lubricants that have been used, the bottles have been empty. A lot of times they aren't. They show up or consumers will, without knowing or having an understanding of what their local collection systems are, they will put them in the blue bin or they'll put them in the trash. Putting them in the blue bin, that bottle leaks. Now you've contaminated the rest of that load and it becomes a problem. I think someone mentioned colors and so forth. Black becomes problematic once it gets to the MRF because some of the optical sorters won't pick it up. So it continues to be there are challenges within the collection system that make it difficult. The other thing that lubricants looks at is when it comes to the rigid HDPE packaging that we use, the industry on average uses a lot of PCR, post-consumer recycled content. In many cases, it's 20% and even higher in some situations. So they actually do a pretty good job of recycled content, which is something that needs to continue. But what we look at is when you look at the responsible end markets and looking at reasonable outputs for what happens when it gets collection and processed and where it goes, figuring out what those connection points are between the REMs and recycled content supply, that would be an interesting evaluation to make. And sort of this next slide is what I often bring up to sort of articulate the system level look at what we're trying to deal from a circularity perspective. So we're just talking about packaging right now. This diagram is a simplified version of what circularity looks like from a packaging perspective. This could be applied to any industry. It's been tailored a little bit towards lubricants, but you get the idea. You have your resin, whether that's virgin resin or recycled resin, it has to start there. Then you have your plastic container production, it gets filled. Then there's distribution and consumption. Then your containers get aggregated. Then you're transporting them and moving them. Then you're processing them. And then you're getting them back into some sort of resin source so they can be reused. And as I look across this sort of area, I've highlighted sort of 5 places where the NLCRC and its membership is starting to sort of take a closer look. We haven't been looking at this, but the first thing that becomes most important, and I think when I have had conversations with multiple entities throughout the value chain, not just producers, not just brands, but collectors and processors, getting the material, creating supply is the number one priority. It's what allows other businesses to make investments. It allows other sort of companies to get on board. They're not going to believe it until they see it. So supply is sort of the tip of the iceberg here. We've got to start generating supply, and that's what EPR is going to do. Then we have to find recycling solutions that sustain quality. We don't use terms like downcycling or things like that. I think the idea is to sustain the quality of the materials so you can maximize them for the next iteration or the next revolution, right? And then, so the key here is to find end uses for recycled packaging, which could be resourcing your materials. So think of, that space between consumption and aggregation. Think of that as new supply or new mining. Oil and gas is mined. That's how hydrocarbons are generated. Think of consumers as a new source. And how do we start to extract that and generate value? So that's where, if you can begin to resource and use more PCR, then there's going to have to be the assumption that we're going to have to continue to look at the design of packaging and to assure that you can accommodate greater PCR diversity. It becomes very difficult in the lubricant space because, the packaging itself has to be a certain size. It's got to fit into an engine. And we all know that there is an American love affair with cars and automobiles and lubricants. So you're dealing with perception. But I think that the design of packaging and lubricant packaging is a very mature industry, but there is always sort of innovation and exploration going on. And then I think that last piece comes to the consumer. I don't think anyone would disagree that when you look at Europe and Canada versus the United States, they have better discipline around sortation and recycling than we do. So we have some work to do. And there's some messaging to work on. So I think that, a lot of times You'll hear discussions that tries to paint consumers into this corner of the victim of all of this. They are also a stakeholder. They also have a role to play. I do believe that, whether it's industry or government or other members of the value chain, there is certainly an education and awareness campaign that is necessary, but there is absolutely a role to play on item number 5. So I think that this is sort of how we can get these pieces connected and ensure that this is happening at a macro level and then at an industry level, and then where appropriate, where you have the oddballs like lubricants, paint, ag products, and so forth, there needs to be pathways that allow these groups to operate separately, bringing product and packaging or waste product and packaging together because it just makes sense. So we need flexibility to allow those things to happen. And we're still going through what I would call the disruption phase of EPR. That explains the lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. It's part of the process, right? So I think that it would be great if we could take a pause on policy and get some execution to work some of these kinks out. At least that would be my preference, but I'm just one person. So that's sort of where we're
check
at.
real quick there for you,
Yeah,
Tristan.
I'm good. I just wanted to sort of close out here, Charlie, with just these are the things that the NLC is working on. So broad sweeping solutions on lubricants. We're also advocating to allow us to be, from a legislative perspective, that allows us to create separation. But also, we are not just producer focused or brand focused. We are trying to engage all members of the value chain. I think that's what makes us unique, and we welcome anybody to that conversation. So I'll stop there and flip it over to I think Jay is next.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Tristan. Very informative, a lot of information, a lot of questions in my head, and hopefully our viewers as well have that same going there. Yeah, let's bring Jay Bassett on board. Jay, you're going to kind of lead us through some what we heard today. So it's all you.
Jay, you're muted. And we're also seeing your email.
I know.
Okay.
Hang on a minute. I grabbed the wrong screen. As soon as I get it to grab. Here we go. Sorry about
you,
that.
Jay.
I think now I got the right screen.
It looks perfect. Just do slideshow and we're good.
Yeah. All right. So there's two folds of what I'm going to try to do today as we wrap this up is I did take a number of notes and try to find some correlation between what Heidi talked about and lubricants around this concept of responsible end markets in EPR. And at the same time, I'm going to give a little bit of background around NRC's work in this space, particularly as we're looking at, maybe as I heard from both Tristan and Heidi, that recycling is becoming increasingly complex and is being shaped by legislation, accounting systems, regulatory interpretations, and market narratives that are coming from multiple places. And I think, as Tristan says, how do you make sense out of this, right? And I want to touch on, as I go through this idea of the role of the stakeholder and the stakeholders in terms of how do we define people as stakeholders in this process between the idea of them as consumers, right? That also bring values to these systems, but also in the context that they go beyond just being consumers, that they're people living their daily lives that are impacted by these systems as well. And I'm going to kind of touch a little bit on that. And then I wanted to, build on both on some systems level thinking around the idea of materials management and public health into this and introduce that as we talk about end markets, I think it's a really critical bridge between what I call mitigation and long-term value creation. And mitigation is those things like standards, compliance, and those policy pieces. But there is another one that I've heard both Heidi and Tristan talk about long-term value creation. What does this mean for both local and national supply chains? And I'm going to talk a little bit about local supply chains as well. So with that, I just wanted to maybe as we set kind of some of the key takeaways as we're talking about this, is that I want, that as we look at particularly plastics, and there's a reason I'm putting plastics up here is because I'm going to share with you all some outputs that kind of align with both speakers around a survey we did among the National Recycling Coalition membership on plastics and how we look at plastics in the context of recycling and in the context of some outputs around EPR and responsible end markets. And some outputs around systems drivers on those end markets that even as we look at our members go through what I call mitigation, but actually go to what they call value creation, which is folks like our partners through Goodwill. They're actually looking at building new value creation within reuse markets as part of what could be a responsible end market. And then the last thing I want to touch on, and I think Heidi, you really hit on this, that we got to remember that public health and people remains a connector in all these conversations. And Tristan, I think you touched on that as well, really around the idea that consumers are part of the value chain, are critical stakeholders. Probably the only other comment I'd say, we probably have to be careful how we use the word extract and extract value from consumers or people, but I think the concept is valid. So one of the things, and I wanted to kind of drive through this pretty quickly, is that we did do a survey that we've got, and I won't go into all the details of how many and the questions and all that, but one thing I'm just going to point out a couple of takeaways. One is that when we looked at plastics and plastic production, particularly around the idea of recyclability, that across the membership, that 83% viewed it to be a severe issue and one that harms environment, climate, and what I call fence line communities, which is really another word for people and people's health, right? And that in the end, what people talked about and what kind of came out of some consensus through those survey results was the idea that strong policy and regulatory frameworks were critical, which Heidi, I know you're touching on, and we'll talk a little bit about Tristan, what you talked around this issue between harmonization, standards, and flexibility, and maybe a little bit of why we do that. Producer responsibility and accountability, what does that mean? Which includes things like claims, the idea of infrastructure and engagement needing to be invested in. I think, Tristan, you touched on that, particularly around consumers as stakeholders in the value chain, and that they have a role, as you said, from extracting value from consumers and being able to participate in this system. And then the idea of leadership and governance, and what I'd like to put in is the idea that we have an opportunity here for community well-being as part, and that was part of the outcomes that we got from the survey. So 3 things I'm going to touch on: system level challenges, which both Heidi and Tristan talked about, really around that a system around disposability. And what I really want to talk about maybe is durable material stewardship as a centering conversation that came out of the survey. The other thing we talked about was solutions around life cycle and sustainable material management views. So I know the tendency is, Heidi, you touched on this on the tub and tap, that the tendency is that we stay buoyed and kind of centered on this as a waste management or mitigation conversation, but maybe we should be looking at solutions that also address life cycle health issues, as well as opportunities for value creation that the markets could bring in terms of finding better uses for some of these materials. And then the last part, Heidi, which you touched on, is that if we don't keep people centered, and I mean people, not just consumers, and that we address health and justice issues within our production systems, then I think, we are, in the end, we're going to end up with, more litigation and lawsuits as we try to make these changes. Some of the themes we came up with, and I'm going to touch on a little bit, is, I want to talk a little bit about reuse and refill systems. This is the idea that maybe we can look at end markets and responsible end markets that go beyond just the traditional global supply chain and recovery systems that we see through MRFs. That as we look at producer responsibility and accountability, that emerged as probably the most frequently discussed policy approach. So as we talk about harmonization, and we talk about state preemption, and we talk about innovation, I think this becomes a really important concept. The idea of public health issues, that we do have to address the human health issues around materials that we recover and how we use them. And then the recycling realities with both Tristan and Heidi have touched on as well. One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit is just the public health and environmental justice side. We do have to recognize that, particularly as we look at plastics and plastic packaging, that we do have chemical additives and other chemicals in there that we yet don't really address, and in many ways are not really regulated. We have the issues around leakage that Heidi, you touched on, about microplastics in media and air, that we've got to turn down the tap, as well as find ways to pull more of that material out through mitigation or circularity systems. We also have to recognize that these do impact, as we look at production, as we look at circular economy, that people are impacted by that, and how do we mitigate that, where the life cycle burdens, to some degree, remain unevenly distributed between people, nature, and ecology. I do want to touch on what Heidi said upstream. That's what came out of the survey as well, that plastic production is growing faster than recycling systems can manage. So it's a nice way of saying that recycling alone isn't going to be able to solve our problems around, and circularity has to mean more than just recycling, maybe in the way we have defined it. And I'll touch on that. And that policies should look at, also prioritizing reduction strategies, and where we have mitigation, which manages the systems, but then unless we address production growth and we look at other ways to move up hierarchy in terms of how we look at end markets through reuse and other mechanisms, that we're probably not going to get there alone, simply because we still have too much stuff coming out of the tap. We also got out of the survey recycling realities around system integrity. This comes back to, I think, Tristan, you have covered on this, around the difficulties we have around hard to recycle materials, as well as those that may have hazardous substances, and how do we manage that? We've talked about in there, that came out of our survey, recyclability claims that lack viable end markets, and then in those claims of how do we define what end markets are, as well as the definitions and the changing definitions and standards around recycled content that we are seeing within policy solutions right now, that just add additional confusion, that go beyond the solid waste system, which was really set up in '65 and still remains this way, that local governments are accountable for solid waste systems, which drive some of the harmonization issues that we talked about, where states have a limited role that was delegated through EPA under municipal solid waste, that some states do more than the federal standards, and many states do not, which adds additional issues around harmonization, and how do we define definitions? How do we look at preemption versus harmonization at the state level? And what does that mean for supply chains, both global supply chains as well as local? And I think at the end, and Heidi, you touched on this, that our members talked about a lot, was traceability, measurable recovery outcomes do matter, standards, labeling, and claims is a key place that we need to work on. So with that, our key takeaways was system level responses, diverse actions, investment in infrastructure. And the other part we put in is that solutions should be and must be people-centered to address health and chemical risks, but also protect communities and maybe open up some new opportunities as well. Recycling system modernization. So we think that reuse logistics and materials innovation is part of that, right? That goes back into, as we called it radical collaboration with industry in terms of looking at not just global supply chains, but what does this really mean at the local level and through state policy frameworks like EPR that California is doing to make these things work as a place of innovation. So one of the things that we're talking about is, and that came out of all our conversations is, on our report that we approved at the end of the month on the survey we did was, what is a responsible end market and what is the key to responsible end markets as part of this bridge between, mitigation efforts of how do we drive circularity, but at the same time, use that as also mechanisms to look at how do we actually turn down the tap. And some of the things that, and I think we touched on this, transparency and traceability, what does that mean? How do we verify what recovery means? Life cycle accountability. Heidi, I know you touched on community value and protection, we talk about. And then Tristan, I knew you talked a lot about measurable environmental outcomes and components that you were talking about within collection system challenges, designs around rigids and how manufacturers and producers respond to that and be able to measure those outcomes in a way that is real, transparent, and for our consumers or our public is something they can readily understand. So the other thing I want to touch on that from our, our perspective, we have a number of members that are really looking at this idea around responsible end markets about local markets. And this idea, no different than our electrical system around, instead of grid being one way, that the idea of a distributed grid, which is flexible, which allows energy to flow back up. Maybe that we also have opportunities for distributed end markets and look at end market design and responsible end market policy that also supports local end market development and value creation, where kind of the way I was looking at this is EPR as a circular infrastructure, as a platform for circular value creation beyond just a compliance mechanism, right, around standard structures, harmonization definitions, but also opens the door for value creation at the local level that we're seeing entities like Goodwill that has 3,300 reuse stores that are looking at how do they take those materials and those textiles and deliver that in new end markets in local manufacturing capability. We also have, I think it was through US Plastic Pack, there was a conversation just last week with First Star Recycling up in Nebraska that we're actually working on and actually sorting out materials and developing and remanufacturing that into new products within a regional market as one way of them looking at beyond just the typical MRF collection and separation back into global supply chains as another valuation with them that provides value back in to those local markets on new products. So as we talk, for me, is part of what I'm thinking about here is we're talking about mitigation a lot, which is around the idea of compliance systems, around standards and harmonization and definitions. But the question is mitigation alone sufficient or not? And I, in my view, I view it's not sufficient because it's not going to get at turning off the tap. That in order to do this, we have to really start looking at reuse, refill, redesign, and safer materials as foundational to mitigation. And that circularity, prevent harm, but provide value, not just from managing waste, but really provides value back into communities that go back into the ability to use those materials in a way that they can actually benefit at the local level from, and that is precautionary and does not prevent harm. And that the last part was for me is that recycling policy should restore trust and measurable outcomes, which Heidi, I know you touched on, and so did you, Tristan, around, this idea of harmonization, definitions, and definitions that will go across potentially 50 states, and in some cases across 18,000 municipalities on how they define both either recycling or zero waste policies that may or may not be aligned with infrastructure that's currently in place, though certainly there are opportunities within local reuse markets and local infrastructure that's already in place in many places, like the 3,300 reuse stores, to be able to address some of that. I did want to mention, as we talk about this, that this conversation around harmonization, the need for harmonization, that there's also a conversation of harmonization versus preemption, that there are a number of there's good federal rules or federal legislation efforts that are underway, but there are also some other ones that are more industry-led stewardship models that really look at state preemption of some of the innovation, Heidi, that you talked about. So I think we do need to dive in and have a conversation between harmonization versus preemption, standards and compliance around harmonization, but make sure that we're not taking away from the ability for both individual industry players with hard to recycle materials or states to be able to put in place innovation at the same place in the marketplace and use valuations and new valuations within the marketplace to help drive that innovation within the context of compliance and standards. So I just want to make folks underway that there are a number of, and we touched on this during our last webinar, of federal efforts and congressional legislative efforts to redefine recycling through rulemaking and regulation that may or may not be aligned with what we're seeing some out of the 7 states and what they're trying to do around EPR and the idea and this concept around responsible end markets. So I want to come back to, basically is a systems-based circular economy. This is what we've been talking about. Systems thinking. Heidi, I picked up on your regeneration over extraction. We need to be thinking in that lens. We have to have evidence and measurable outcomes. Tristan, as you had already shared, around how do we actually design outcomes, even around hard to recycle items, and that we look at shared value creation as along with compliance as part of a systems approach to really looking at what responsible end markets are, how do we define them, and then how do we set the standards and compliance structures around and policy structures that make sense to do that.
Excellent.
So closing takeaways, just again, recycling remains rooted in real recovery and outcomes. Heidi, EPR must be accountable and responsible. Oh, sorry about the spelling error. Responsible and diverse end markets are essential to this. Means wide look at what end markets could be. Public health has to be central. And again, I think we've both all touched on that. Circularity can't become accounting fiction, which is a threat that's out there that we need to talk about and make sure, as we know, there's going to be litigation and other things, but if we can radically collaborate, maybe we can avoid some of that. So that's me. And picking up on some of the things.
That was great, Jay. Thank you so much. A lot of information and a good way to tie that together. We're running along here on our time, so I'd like to jump to our Q&A. I want to remind everybody, just go ahead, please. You can put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A box and we can address them. We still have a closing from our vice president that we'd like to get to, but I think the first question, it could go to either Heidi and maybe Tristan, but mostly Heidi. It says, given the plastic cups are often, so mostly Heidi, because I remember the slide, given that plastic cups are often classified as rigid plastic containers, subject to RIC requirements in many states, what would a more harmonized approach look like to reduce consumer confusion without creating added cost and complexity that would impact affordability?
I
Kind of a
couldn't answer
mouthful.
that by myself. That's a very big question that would need a lot of different stakeholders at the table. There's a lot of, again, across states, we've got different problems. And so if we're talking harmony across states, that's a very complicated answer that I could not answer by myself.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The only thing that I would say is, the harmonization problem occurs, particularly when it comes to claims and messaging, is different requirements in different states.
Mhm.
I think the goal would be, it's not the messaging, it's making sure the messaging requirements are the same from state to state. Now, there'd be an infrastructure change if the molders of the plastic have to change what it says on the bottom. Yes, there would be an investment. How significant would that be on affordability? I can't answer that question. The key here is that it's the same thing. That's
Mhm.
the challenge.
And I would put a caveat to that. So one of the problems we're seeing when some states lead and other states are dragged along, right? So we had the American Chemistry Council going around in the 80s passing legislation to add chasing arrows to packages, even when they weren't getting recycled. They knew that signal to the consumer because they have a report on it that was Consumer Brands does. That was going to, make people buy more because then they thought it was recyclable and they put it in the recycling bin. We had to unwind that law in California in order to get the law we have now, which is going to take those chasing arrows off if they don't hit 60% recycling. They're challenging that. And one of the arguments that ACC actually said in the testimony was, we want harmony. And I said, we do too. We just don't want harmonized lying. And so we have to be careful. Like, we're not going to drop the bar just for the sake of harmony. It has to make sense and it has to be truthful. So, can we agree on what truthful means? Because what level of recycling is recyclable? We thought we were generous by a D- with a 60%. That's not an A+. That's not anywhere near where I'd like to be, but it's a good start when we're at 20 and 30. So, and that can be amended over time. But anyway, I just want to put that caution out there.
Yeah. And I just want to add, Charlie, I mean, we have to understand these systems have been in place for over 100 years, right? If we look at solid waste systems, they're always designed for local governments to be part of it. It's really a public health and sanitation. It was never envisioned, even when the Solid Waste Disposal Act was signed in 1965, that local governments would become rational players in an economic system. It was never viewed that way until the energy crisis, right? And even when RCRA was passed, it even confused a little bit more because, as Heidi said, it gave states the ability to take the federal minimum standards and go beyond that, because that's what RCRA said. States could derive more stringent requirements. So we have some states that do the bare minimum under solid waste, and other states like California that really have embraced and looked beyond that in terms of material recovery that goes beyond just MSW disposal. But we got to recognize that those policies have been in place, were built on a foundation of urbanization around public health and sanitation that the federal side, has not yet even amended the federal minimum standards that they put in 1980 to do what? Put it in the landfill. So, these are challenges. And then you've got, as we know, players in the market space and it's all, part of what plays about what makes advantage for them that, monkey around with state legislator and other pieces of policy to make harmonization work for them. And that's why I still like, Heidi, your conversation on radical collaboration. I think we got to do that. And we got to do that on truth and data and make sure. I'd like to say maybe the last thing is we need to get rid of the word consumer. I hate the word consumer. It's really the word people. How do we get people to understand this and participate in this in a more holistic way versus just an extraction point at the end of a value chain?
You got to take trash seriously, right, folks? We have to really look at what we have. I think before we jump over I don't see any more questions popping up, but in the chat, Gary put in there the federal legislation watch list, and that did get brushed upon in the conversation today about a number of variety of different legislation that are trying to be passed, and some have some good take to it, but some really need some scrutiny put to them and aren't beneficial. You know, when there's people trying to change definitions of recycling. So take a look at that link that Gary put there. You see that in the chat box. Be really enlightening for all of us. And it's something that the NRC is looking at as well, is to help continue reducing this confusion. I think that's a really big thing. The truth in recycling is a big topic that I hear of a lot from my members and around the industry. The people want to recycle, but when things are mislabeled and not correct. I mean, I was sharing with somebody the other day, I have a little pill bottle for my vitamins, and it actually says, do not recycle this container. And, you know, that goes against everything else that we've been
Well, I have to
up
say,
date. Yeah.
having worked with the pharmaceutical industry and passed the only bill in the country to make the manufacturers be responsible for end of life of pill bottles and needles, there's some medications are very active at a very low dose, and you do
Yeah.
not want those. Again, if they're plastic, they are absorbing those chemicals. Some of them are radioactive and
certainly hope
ending up
mine
in the
isn't.
recycling stream. So we have a
Right.
complicated system, and we have to keep things separate and clean. And that is why I do not want this commingling of hazardous and non-hazardous. I think it's extremely dangerous unless we're testing for every flipping chemical, which we're not going to. It's too expensive. We've got to be better at this and pay more attention to it.
And I would just
and,
tell you, that's a fundamental, as you know,
Yes.
that's the whole conversation around life cycle approaches to looking at chemicals and materials that go in so that we understand these things and we don't end up with another forever chemical problem down the road.
Yeah. My point was just the confusion and the challenge and the conversation of harmonization. So a lot of work for us to do out there. At this point, let me double check. Okay, we're clear. I'd like to turn it over to the Vice President of the Board of Directors, Jeremy. Jeremy has some closing conversation for us. We're about almost 20 after the hour. So Jeremy, go ahead and take the screen and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm not going to share any slides, but I'm just going to chat for a minute with y'all. Appreciate you being here today. I'm Jeremy Drake. I serve as Vice President of the NRC and also Chair of NRC's Plastic Subcommittee. Thanks to the speakers for adding your perspectives to this conversation today. Again, thank you to everyone for attending. Today's webinar was part 2 in a series that NRC's hosting called Reshaping Recycling. It's a webinar series, and we do have a recording of the first one from May, and maybe Charlie can help get you a recording of that. If you're interested, I recommend it. We talked about legislation, as you'll see in the link Gary shared. And with this webinar series, that we're seeking to convene diverse voices that together will provide a broad perspective on these issues that we're facing today, particularly when it comes to plastic. Radical collaboration, we've heard that term a lot. That's what we're shooting for here, right? And this focus on plastics really emerged, as Jay pointed out, from the NRC member survey that we conducted last year. We're going to be publishing the report that the Plastic Subcommittee prepared. We're going to be publishing that, sharing that soon. But I just want to follow up. Jay pointed out that these survey results that we got, they highlighted that we need to see this issue as a systems issue and not as a waste management issue. We need to center people, we need to center communities in the emerging solutions, particularly when it comes to plastic, right? And doing that will ensure that we're creating systems that will truly be sustainable over time. And I think that what makes me feel hopeful is we're beginning to see this expanded framing where we're moving beyond value chains and toward broader impacts and potential benefits, the value to people and communities that Jay talked about. And it's beginning, I think, to reshape recycling with the move toward responsible end markets, reshaping it in a way that I think is moving in the right direction. So I encourage you all to comment on the draft responsible end market standard that Heidi mentioned. I'm going to drop that link to the chat into the chat so that you can directly access that. Deadline for comments July 7th. So take a look at that and add your voice. Before we wrap, I just have a couple of things I want to highlight coming up for the NRC. Later this year in August 5th and 6th, we're going to be hosting a virtual National Recycling Congress. So save the date. We're going to be on Zoom. Registration will be open very soon. You can register at nrcrecycles.com. Our theme this year is From East to West, Circularity is Best. We're going to be hearing from our state recycling organizations from across the country. We're going to be hearing about their successes and their challenges. We're going to have some featured keynotes that you're going to want to check out. And lots of other sessions over those two days. We're working on getting CEU credits as well for those of you who need those for your continuing education units. Lastly, coming up in September, end of September, SWANA's 2026 Archon is going to be live in St. Louis in person. And NRC is participating in day one. We're partnering with Circular St. Louis. We're going to be talking about the local perspective of recycling, sustainable materials management at this conference. And those of you who register for Archon through the NRC will get a discounted rate. So get in touch with Charlie for more information on that, for more information on the NRC. And if you're interested in becoming a member or supporting NRC, please reach out. Again, thank you to Heidi and NSAC. Feel free to reach out to NSAC if you want more information about that organization. They're a key partner in putting this webinar together today. Thanks again to Tristan for being here, and thanks for Jay, NRC Board Chair, for contributing his thoughts and perspectives today as well. Stay tuned for potentially a third in our webinar series, Reshaping Recycling. We're working on that now. Maybe in the fall we'll be coming out with that. A lot coming up though. So follow us on the socials, get in touch, get on our mailing list, and we will look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jeremy. That will conclude our webinar for today. So I want to thank Tristan. Great insight. Heidi, thank you. Jay, always your wisdom is something I listen to and follow. I want to let everybody know that all of the recordings, the presentations will be sent to each of us. And also, Jeremy brought up the idea of our May 21 webinar recording. So we have a YouTube channel. So I'll make sure everybody has links to those YouTube channels as soon as I get everything and have it uploaded. But for now, thank you on behalf of the National Recycling Coalition for attending today. I saw some people coming in kind of late. So again, you will get the opportunity to get all of the videos and the presentations for today. So with that, do our panelists have any final words they want to? We have less than 5 minutes.
I'll just say, I can't thank you all enough for being here and being radical collaborators. Life is way too short. We're going to have a lot more power together. Everybody needs to talk to each other, respect each other's opinions, and find agreement where we can. That's how we're going to move forward together in this industry and also in this country. So stay safe and stay well.
Heidi said it all. Thank you very much.
All right.
Whatever Heidi said, I'm behind her. I'll follow you anywhere. Okay.
Hey, this is hard work. It really is. And everybody here and listening are the professionals leading this. So we have to come together and do this work. With that, thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you. Don't forget our National Recycling Congress, August 5th and 6th. And with that, I bid you adieu. Thank you.